International Harvester employed 100,000 people. It operated plants on 6 continents. Its red tractors worked the soil in 180 countries. It was the 4th largest company in the United States, bigger than General Motors in the EE fields, bigger than Ford on the farm, bigger than anything the American heartland had ever produced. Then one man walked in the door and burned it to the ground. This is the story of a Virginia farm boy who built a machine that fed the world. And the story of how 150 years later, a CEO from Xerox showed up, pocketed a $1.8 million bonus, picked a fight with 35,000 union workers, and triggered the single largest corporate collapse in American manufacturing history. The losses ran to $2.4 billion in 3 years. The farm equipment division was sold to a competitor for pennies. The name, International Harvester, was sold off like furniture at an estate sale. Today, the Farmall Works in Rock Island, Illinois, is gone. The Chicago headquarters is gone. The red tractors still roll across the American Midwest, but they carry a different name on the hood. This is the story of how that happened. It begins not in a boardroom and not in a factory. It begins in a field in Virginia's Shenandoah Valley in the summer of 1831, with a 22-year-old who had no engineering degree, no formal training, and no reason to believe he could do something that had defeated every man who tried it before him, including his own father. Stay with me until the end. Before we begin, please take a moment to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and comment where you're watching from. Now, let's get into it. The McCormick family farm at Walnut Grove sat in Rockbridge County, Virginia. Rolling hills, red clay soil, the kind of land that demanded more from a man than it gave back. Robert McCormick, Cyrus's father, had spent the better part of 2 decades trying to build a mechanical reaper, a machine that could cut grain the way a scythe could, but faster, more efficient, a machine that could do the work of a dozen men in a fraction of the time. He failed. Over and over, he failed. He died knowing he'd failed. His son Cyrus picked up the project when he was 22 years old, working out of the family's blacksmith shop. Same cast iron tools, same dirt. Floor, same Virginia sun beating down on the roof. Within 6 weeks, he had something. Not just something on paper, something in the field. In the summer of 1831, he demonstrated a working mechanical reaper at a neighbor's farm near Steele's Tavern, Virginia. The machine moved through standing grain like nothing anyone had seen. It cut 15 acres a day. Without it, a team of strong men working from dawn to dusk might manage 3. He patented the design in 1834. And then, for most of a decade, almost nobody bought it. Farmers were suspicious. They'd been farming the same way for 1,000 years, and they weren't about to trust a rattling iron contraption over a scythe they understood. One description of the early reaper called it something resembling a cross between a wheelbarrow, a chariot, and a flying machine. That wasn't entirely unfair, but Cyrus McCormick was not just an inventor. He was a salesman, and he was a strategist. He guaranteed performance. He offered to let farmers buy on credit, pay over time. He trained salesmen to demonstrate the machine in the field during harvest season, not in a showroom, but in an actual field, cutting actual grain, so the farmer could see with his own eyes what the machine could do. And when the vast grain prairies of the Midwest began opening up in the 1840s, Ohio, Indiana, Illinois, he understood that Virginia was the wrong place to be. In 1847, he moved to Chicago. He built a factory on the North Branch of the Chicago River. His first investor was William Ogden, the same man who would later become Chicago's first mayor. That first year, the factory produced 500 reapers. By 1856, it was making more than 4,000 a year. By 1858, the McCormick Harvesting Machine Company was the largest farm equipment manufacturer in the country. And then Chicago burned. The Great Fire of 1871 destroyed the factory completely. McCormick was in New York when he heard the news. He discussed it with his wife, and they made a decision. Sell the New York house, go back to Chicago, rebuild, bigger than before. He did exactly that. The rebuilt factory dwarfed the original. When he died in 1884, the company was still growing, still dominant. His last words reportedly 2 syllables. Work, work. His son Cyrus Jr. took over. And by 1902, the company was so large, so deeply embedded in American agriculture, that J.P. Morgan himself, the most powerful financier in the country, took an interest. Morgan engineered one of the most significant corporate mergers in American history. The McCormick Harvesting Machine Company combined with its largest rival, the Deering Harvester Company, and three smaller manufacturers, Milwaukee, Plano, and Warder, Bushnell and Glessner, to form a single entity. They called it International Harvester Company. Cyrus McCormick Jr. became the first president. The McCormick family held 42.6% of the new company. The Deering family held 34.4%. Morgan and the smaller shareholders divided the rest. It wasn't just a merger. It was the birth of a machine that would spend the next 80 years feeding the world. International Harvester's first years were an exercise in dominance. The combined entity controlled roughly 85% of the American grain harvester market. The U.S. government actually sued it under antitrust law in 1912. The company survived that suit, was forced to sell a few smaller subsidiaries, and kept growing anyway. In 1924, IH introduced the Farmall. This was the machine that would define the company for the next half-century. The Farmall was smaller and more versatile than anything the market had seen before. A tricycle-designed tractor, with a narrow front end that let it work between rows of corn and cotton and other tall crops that earlier, wider tractors couldn't navigate. American family farmers didn't need a massive steam-powered beast to plow flat prairie wheat fields. They needed something that could maneuver through a 40-acre cornfield without trampling half of it. The Farmall was that machine. It became the best-selling tractor in America almost immediately. By the 1930s, International Harvester held 44% of the entire U.S. tractor market under the Farmall name, twice the market share of the nearest competitor, a company out of Illinois called Deere & Company. IH wasn't just winning. It was lapping the field. Then came the Second World War, and the company that built America's farms pivoted, like so many others, to build America's war machine. International Harvester produced torpedoes, artillery systems, artillery shells, bulldozers, and truck engines. The red-painted factories turned to the work of defense, and they were good at it. When the war ended, the veterans came home to the Midwest farmland, and they came home to International Harvester tractors. The post-war decades were years of genuine prosperity. Plants in Chicago, Rock Island, Fort Wayne, Louisville, Memphis. The IH footprint across the American industrial Midwest was massive and seemingly permanent. By the 1960s, the company's reach had extended far beyond its Chicago headquarters. It manufactured trucks, construction equipment, scout SUVs, and refrigerators alongside its tractors and combines. The name on the hood was everywhere, and that, it would later become clear, was part of the problem. International Harvester had grown so large, spread across so many product lines, that it had become very difficult to run well. Trucks and tractors and construction equipment and consumer appliances do not naturally share the same management DNA. The executives who understood how to compete against John Deere on the farm did not necessarily understand how to compete against Caterpillar on the construction site or against Ford on the truck lot. The company's management culture had calcified. Promotions came from within. Leadership had been drawn from the same narrow pool for so long that the pool had gone stale. New ideas were not encouraged. The board had a long tradition of paying out generous dividends to shareholders rather than reinvesting in the plants. The plants aged. The product lines aged. The competitive margins shrank. By the mid-1970s, IH's profit margins were roughly half those of its competitors. The company was still enormous, the fourth largest corporation in the United States, with revenues of $8 billion a year. But the engine underneath that size was running cold. John Deere, that same company from Illinois that IH had been doubling in market share back in the 1930s, had been quietly closing the gap for 20 years. In 1958, Deere overtook International Harvester to become the largest farm equipment manufacturer in the United States. It was a passing of the crown that barely made the news, but it was a warning that nobody in the Chicago headquarters chose to take seriously. And the more years that passed without a serious response, the harder it would eventually be to turn the ship around. In 1977, International Harvesters Board made a decision that would, within 5 years, destroy the company. They hired an outsider. In the entire history of International Harvester, 75 years as a corporation, the company had never once brought in a chief executive from outside its own walls. Every president, every chairman, every CEO had come up through the ranks. That was the culture. That was the tradition. That was, in retrospect, a significant part of the problem. Archie R. McArdle was 51 years old, born in Hazel Park, Michigan, the first person in his family to attend college. He had served in the Army Air Forces in the Second World War, graduated from the University of Michigan with an MBA, and built his career at Ford Motor Company before becoming president of Xerox Corporation. He was lean, precise, and completely certain that what International Harvester needed was what he had to offer: cost discipline, modernization, and a willingness to confront a labor union that he believed had been allowed to accumulate far too much power. The board paid accordingly. McArdle received a $1.5 million signing bonus, a $460,000 annual salary, and a $1.8 million personal loan at 6% interest. He was, by a significant margin, one of the highest-paid executives in America. His early results justified the price, or seemed to. He cut spending by $640 million. He launched an $879 million 3-year program to modernize the aging plants. By the end of 1978, profit had risen to $370 million, up from $203 million. Sales reached a record $8.4 billion. IH was performing better than it had in years. But the margins were still only half those of Caterpillar and Deere. And McArdle was not a man who accepted half measures. He had identified what he believed was the root cause of the problem. The United Auto Workers Union contract at International Harvester was, compared to the contracts at competitors, extraordinarily generous to workers. IH employees had no compulsory overtime. The work rules were, in McArdle's assessment, inefficient and outdated. He calculated that these provisions had cost the company $1.3 billion over the previous 3 years. He intended to change them. The UAW contract expired on November 1, 1979. The day before the expiration, International Harvester publicly announced its executive compensation figures for the year. Archie McArdle had received a bonus, on top of his existing salary, of $1.8 million the next morning, November 2nd. 35,000 International Harvester workers walked off the job. What followed was one of the longest strikes in UAW history. It ran for 172 days, nearly 6 months. While the strikers held the picket lines, the economy that had been propping up IH's record revenues began to collapse. Interest rates, already climbing, were about to go vertical. Paul Volcker at the Federal Reserve was tightening monetary policy with a ferocity not seen since the 1930s. By early 1981, the federal funds rate would reach 20%. For farmers trying to finance equipment purchases, that number was a death sentence. Nobody was buying tractors, nobody was buying combines. The farm economy, which had been roaring through the 1970s on the back of commodity exports, was beginning to seize up. And in January 1980, President Jimmy Carter imposed a grain embargo on the Soviet Union following the invasion of Afghanistan. The Soviet Union had been one of the single largest buyers of American grain. Overnight, a massive export market vanished. IH management, watching the strike from the other side of the table, had been confident that when it ended, the dealers would need to restock heavily. They kept the plants running at reduced capacity through the strike, building inventory. When the settlement came in April 1980, the company had warehouses full of tractors and combines that almost nobody wanted to buy. The settlement itself gave IH almost nothing of what McArdle had sought. The union kept its work rules. The overtime provisions remained. International Harvester had paralyzed itself for 6 months, infuriated its workforce, and gained precisely zero from the exercise. The losses for the strike period, $479 million. The losses for the following fiscal year, $397 million. For fiscal years 1980, 1981, and 1982 combined, International Harvester lost $2.4 billion, the largest 3-year loss of any American company in history up to that point. The company that had once employed 100,000 people, that had sold tractors in 180 countries, that had been the 4th largest corporation in the United States, defaulted on its short-term loans in March 1981 and went begging to 225 creditor banks for a debt restructuring package covering nearly $5 billion. The moment you know a company is truly in trouble is not when it announces the loss. It's when the men at the top start publicly reassuring everyone that everything is under control. In the spring of 1981, International Harvester's leadership was issuing exactly those kinds of reassurances. The debt restructuring was described as prudent financial management. The plant closures, and there were plant closures beginning immediately, were described as strategic consolidation. The layoffs were described as right-sizing for market conditions. The language was carefully calibrated to prevent panic, and it failed because the numbers kept coming. Archie McArdle lasted another year after the strike ended. On May 3, 1982, one day after the UAW ratified a new concessionary contract, International Harvester's board fired him. The company's 16 directors met over a weekend. The creditor banks, which by this point held enormous leverage over every decision IH made, had pushed for his removal. Time magazine, covering the departure, noted that the real wonder was that McArdle had not been ousted much earlier. He was replaced by Louis Menck, a railroad executive who had no experience running a farm equipment company. Menck lasted 13 months. He was followed by Donald Lennox, who oversaw the final stages of the unraveling. By the end of 1984, all options had run out. International Harvester had spent 3 years trying to trade its way out of a debt structure that the strike and the farm crisis had made structurally unpayable. The banks had financed one restructuring, then another, then a third. Each time the company had promised that recovery was around the corner. Each time, it had not been. The total debt had reached $4.5 billion. Interest payments alone were consuming cash that should have been going into product development, into dealer support, into the kind of investment that keeps a manufacturing company alive and competitive. Meanwhile, John Deere, its main rival, the company it had been lapping in market share in the 1930s, had been spending those years investing precisely in the things IH had been unable to fund. By the early 1980s, the gap between Deere's product quality and IH's had become visible to every farmer who walked into a dealer showroom and compared the two machines side by side. The first piece to go was construction equipment. In 1982, IH sold its Payline construction division to Dresser Industries. It was a clean amputation, painful, but it removed a distraction and generated cash. The Scout, the beloved 4-wheel drive utility vehicle that IH had introduced in 1961 and that had built a fierce following among outdoor enthusiasts and rural drivers, had already been killed in 1980. The Cub Cadet lawn mower brand was sold in 1981 to MTD. Each sale represented a piece of the company's identity, auctioned off to service debt. The men who had spent their careers inside International Harvester watched the pieces go and understood, even if the press releases insisted otherwise, that the core was coming next. By the fall of 1984, the core was indeed next. On November 23, 1984, International Harvester finalized a deal with Tenneco, the Texas-based conglomerate that owned J.I. Case. The farm equipment division, the tractors, the combines, the Farmall brand, the McCormick name, everything that traced back to that field in Virginia in 1831 was sold to become Case IH. The price was approximately $430 million, a fraction of what it had once been worth. The transaction was completed in February 1985. Tractor production. At the Farmall Works in Rock Island, Illinois ceased in 1985. The plant that had been producing International Harvester tractors for decades went quiet. The name International Harvester was itself sold to Tenneco as part of the agricultural deal. The company that bore the name ceased to bear it. The remaining entity, just the truck and engine divisions, was renamed Navistar International Corporation in 1986. The word harvester disappeared from the masthead entirely. The men and women who had worked those plants found out what this meant in the most direct possible way through the closing of the plant they worked in: Rock Island, Chicago, Fort Wayne, Louisville, Memphis. The IH manufacturing footprint across the American Midwest had employed tens of thousands of families across multiple generations. These were not transient workers. These were people who had built their lives around the steady certainty of the plant. The morning shift, the afternoon shift, the paycheck on Friday, the mortgage on the house within driving distance of the factory gates. In cities like Rock Island, Illinois, the factory wasn't just an employer. It was the economic foundation on which everything else rested: the shops, the schools, the churches, the local businesses that existed because the factory existed. When now the factories closed, the damage did not announce itself all at once. It accumulated. First the layoffs, then the foreclosures, then the businesses that served laid-off workers closing their own doors, then the tax base of the city eroding, then the schools losing funding, then the long, slow unraveling that takes decades to work through a community and that no official statistic captures fully. One dealer from the period, recounting the crisis years, described a customer, a dairy farmer he had known for years, a friend, who came into his office, closed the door, sat down, and told him he had declared bankruptcy. The man cried. The dealer said he felt bad for himself. He felt worse for the farmer. Another customer came in during harvest season to buy a combine. Good credit history, long relationship with the dealership. The credit application was denied. The dealer had to call him and ask for the machine back. In an adjoining state, a dealer he had visited 2 days earlier, a man he had talked with about the challenges they were all facing, who had seemed to be dealing with things, entered his parts department after closing hours and shot himself. These were not statistics. These were the consequences of decisions made in boardrooms in Chicago, translated into lives destroyed in the fields and small towns of the American Midwest. The American Business History Center, looking back on International Harvester's collapse, drew a direct comparison to Massey Ferguson, the Canadian tractor giant that fell apart through strikingly similar mechanisms at almost exactly the same time. Two companies, one Canadian, one American, both dominant in global agriculture, both undone by the intersection of debt, management failure, and a farm economy that turned hostile at precisely the worst moment. The parallels are almost eerie. Both companies had spent the 1960s and 1970s expanding aggressively into global markets. Both had allowed their product quality and R&D investment to fall behind more focused competitors. Massey behind Deere in North America, IH behind Deere everywhere. Both had management cultures that had grown insular and resistant to change. Both hit the same global headwinds: the collapse of commodity prices, the explosion of interest rates under Volcker, the Soviet grain embargo, at the same moment of maximum vulnerability. International Harvester's story has one additional layer that Massey's doesn't. The man brought in to save it, Archie McCardle, came from outside the industry with a specific conviction that the union was the problem, that confronting it would restore the company's competitiveness, and pursued that conviction with a rigidity that made the company's destruction faster and more complete than it might otherwise have been. He was not a villain in the simple sense. He diagnosed a real problem. The union contracts were genuinely more expensive than those at Deere and Caterpillar, but his willingness to trigger a 6-month strike during a period when the farm economy was beginning to weaken, and his apparent failure to understand just how bad the timing was, speaks to a deeper disconnection from the reality of the industry he was supposed to be running. The men who worked beside Deere and Caterpillar and knew IH from the inside had been warning for years that the company was falling behind. IMWS. Technology in product quality, in the kind of iterative improvement that keeps a manufacturing enterprise competitive decade over decade. The axial flow combine, IH's genuinely innovative new harvester introduced in the late 1970s, was an excellent machine. It arrived in the market just as the market ceased to exist. The investment in new technology, real and substantial, was timed perfectly badly. The brand itself lived on in pieces, scattered across corporate structures that bore no resemblance to what International Harvester had been. Case IH, the agricultural division, was eventually merged again when Case Corporation and New Holland combined in 1999 to form CNH Global, now CNH Industrial, a Dutch incorporated company controlled by Italy's Agnelli family, the dynasty behind Fiat, Ferrari, and Fiat Chrysler. The red Farmall tractors still roll across American fields. They are still red. They still carry a lineage traceable back to Cyrus McCormick's Virginia farm. But the company that made them, in the form it existed for most of a century, is gone. Navistar International, the truck and engine successor, struggled through the 1990s and 2000s, had its own accounting scandals and financial crises, and was ultimately acquired by Volkswagen's Triton Group in a $3.7 billion deal completed in 2021. In October 2024, Navistar was renamed International Motors. The last syllable of the original name, gone. The Scout, IH's iconic off-road vehicle, produced from 1961 to 1980, the predecessor to the modern SUV in everything but name, was revived in 2023 as an electric vehicle brand by Volkswagen, Scout Motors, based in South Carolina. German capital, American nostalgia, an electric drivetrain. Cyrus McCormick's great-great-grandchildren were not consulted. In 1974, International Harvester produced the 5 millionth tractor to roll off its assembly line at the Farmall Works in Rock Island, Illinois. It was the first tractor manufacturer in the world to reach that number. The event was marked with ceremony. The machine was painted red, as all the machines were painted red, and it rolled off the line at 9 in the morning on February 1st, 1974. And the men who watched it go past had every reason to believe that there would be a 6 millionth, a 7 millionth, that the line would keep running for as long as there were farms to work and farmers to work them. The line stopped in 1985. The tractor that came off the line in those final years is still out there somewhere, in a field, or in a barn, or in a collector's shed. Red paint faded, the IH logo on the hood worn but legible. The machine works. 60, 70 years after it was made, the machine still works. That's the thing about what was built in those plants. The people who built it to last. They built it to go out into a field in Iowa or Kansas or Nebraska and do the same job year after year, decade after decade, without complaint. The machine outlasted the company that made it. It outlasted the brand. It outlasted the factory. It will probably outlast most of the people who remember International Harvester when it was alive and at the center of American life. Cyrus McCormick's last words were, "Work, work." He said them in 1884, in Chicago, in a city he had helped build. By deciding to build his factory there, he spent his life building something. He spent his last breath urging the people around him to keep building. The men who came after him, 100 years later, spent their last years at the company trying not to lose what he had built. They lost it anyway. But the machine in the field still runs. The furrow it cuts is still straight. The grain it harvests still feeds someone, somewhere. That part, at least, he got right.